Hello, we're going to talk for a bit about complex conflicts and particularly conflicts in the public arena, which can sometimes be a little bit difficult to wrap your hands around. So this week you did some reading and some thinking about in any kind of conflict situation who are the people that are at the table answerable to, because there's always multiple layers of conflict going on, even in a personal conflict. If I am going to, I don't know, break up a personal relationship, I may be answerable to my siblings or parent or friends who are going to give me grief about it or something like that. So, even in a very personal situation, there are still other people who are going to participate in this or who you're thinking about being answerable to. Now, when you have a conflict in the public arena, sometimes it feels like, going all the way back to our first lecture when I said don't fight with the furniture, sometimes it can feel like you're fighting with the furniture. What do I mean by that? You have a conflict that doesn't seem as if it has a party on the other side of it. So the first question to ask is, what exactly is your problem? Now, people ask that facetiously all the time, don't they? What is your problem? It's a very important question because you have to know what exactly it is that your concern is. What exactly is it that you would like to have addressed before you can answer the following questions and figure out how to get to having that situation addressed. So, if your problem is that conditions at work are abysmal, then you know that that's what your problem is, and you might try to be a little more specific about that. The pay isn't enough, the hours stink, the schedule keeps changing every week. So this is a problem, but is it a conflict? Yes and no, because it's not really a conflict until you define who's responsible for making those decisions on the other side. Now, in a workplace situation, that can be relatively clear, right? It's management. And that could be your local manager, it could be regional or corporate. In other public issues, the answer is not so clear. Let us say you are suffering from discrimination, that you have been the subject of discrimination based on your race or your ethnicity, or your age, your gender. Um, that's obviously a problem. It's a very serious problem. And who is the party on the other side of that table? It once again feels somewhat amorphous. There's not necessarily one person. It's everybody. It's you want every single person to uh, behave differently and treat you in a civilized and equitable manner. So it's a conflict, and there may be a whole string of individual conflicts, but as a general societal issue, it's very hard to define the conflict as in terms of who is on the other side. So, once you have clearly pinned down what your problem is, the first question to ask is, who are the decision makers who can affect this situation? So, in the workplace, again, the answer is usually management, unless it's your coworkers, but it could be your immediate boss, it could be corporate structure. In something like you are discontent with the cost of higher education, who is it that can influence that? The college administration. If you are at a public college like CCV or University of Vermont, is it the legislature? Is it a board of trustees that runs the college? Who is it that can affect this situation? They are the person on the other side. And if your problem is such that it's something where you have the individual choices of a lot of people on the other side, like, you know, as Well, discrimination was one that I mentioned, where the thing is every single person makes a decision as to how they're going to treat you. Or something like climate change, where every single person makes their own decisions about their lifestyle, their consumption of energy, and their actions towards the planet and their carbon footprint. Um, if if that's the case, then each individual person is actually the opposing party, and you're not going to be able to negotiate with every single person on the planet. So, what are you going to do? You're going to find the influencers, and that may involve legislation, or it may involve social influencers, or someone else who can change this equation, have an effect on changing the equation. So the second question to ask is there a table at which to have this discussion of your conflict now that you've determined what exactly the issue or the problem is, who is on the other side of this that's causing the problem, or that's in conflict with you over how things ought to proceed. Now, is there a place to sit down and have a discussion with them? And then here's the big question. If there isn't, can you create one? So let me again take the example. I'll take a couple of examples here, but the first is unions in regards to a workplace dispute. Why do people unionize? People unionize, workers unionize, because they have dissatisfactions or problems with management and with administration. But there is often the problem that administration is a big body of people, and no one person is going to sit down and say they can resolve these issues. And the other is that there isn't a table for having that discussion. In some workplaces there is. In some workplaces, administration or the business owners are very concerned about sitting down with their workers and working things out. But in many other institutions, administration just will not have those conversations and won't talk about wages, hours, schedules, tasks, work tasks, and so on. So workers will unionize in order to create a unified body, so that at least on this side of the table there is like one voice speaking with administration. And the act of unionizing creates a table that by law management then has to sit down at. First, it creates the table of unionizing, and many employers then do what they can under the law to oppose the unionization. And then once the union has come into effect in a workplace, the administration is compelled to negotiate a contract with the employer. So by law, so the United States law basically makes that table available, and so workers will unionize in order to bring management to the table, and now you have a clearly defined conflict, right? Which is, you've got workers, union members on one side of the table, you've got administration on the other side of the table, and what they're negotiating is the terms of a contract. So now we have a very, very clearly defined conflict, what's going to be in that contract. And it's a question of whether via negotiation, which is what usually happens, or sometimes via arbitration, the terms of that contract get set. And then that contract also, and the union structure also creates an ongoing table, where now when there are problems that are violations of that contract, now when someone's hours suddenly get changed, or their tasks suddenly get changed at work, or there's an issue of discrimination or some other incident that happens, the contract will almost always have a management labor committee, or some sort of review committee that sits down and has a means by which to come to the table, a grievance process by which you can come to the table and talk out each of those things. Now, before there was a union, there would not have been the conversations back and forth between administration and management. So I've been involved personally in a number of unionization efforts. I was involved in unionizing faculty at Champlain College and then at CCV. Um, and once you have that union, then you have regular conversations with administration. And so even if the substance doesn't change, you now have a table, you now have dialogue. And that didn't happen before um, the unions were there. The United Nations is another example of things where parties sit down at it. They created a table so that nations around the world could sit down and have dialogue. Is it perfect? Does it resolve everything? Absolutely not. But before the United Nations, there was not a table at which nations could sit down and discuss their conflicts. It could only happen on an individual basis if people wanted to be there. Let's shift this over, though, to look at something like an issue of discrimination. Um, let's say, or another social issue like climate change. You know, who are the people on the other side? Who are your opponents? The problem is it's huge. It's systemic. It's everybody's lifestyles. It's everybody's reactions. And how are you going to get this down to a table where some things can be resolved to make forward progress? The answer in that situation is that you're only going to be able to do it incrementally. It's going to be one heck of a fight, and you're going to have to focus on different aspects that might be helpful. Um, in in civil rights and discrimination issues, the tactic for quite some time, or the strategy for quite some time, has been to look to legislative answers where they can be put into place, like anti discrimination laws. And even though those can't reach into people's heads and change their attitudes regarding each of their personal actions, it at least sets the legal minimum that sets a standard for behavior, and at least it compels employers and people issuing contracts, and people serving people in restaurants and hotels and so on, to not discriminate without violating the law. And that the strategy is that one hopes that in time, by um, those influencers, the legislature and Congress, having imposed certain minimum standards, that in time people's mindsets and individual thoughts would catch up to that structure. When we look at something like climate change, that's an interesting question as well, where it seems like the opponent on the other side of the table is everybody on the planet, and what are you going to do? And one of the strategies people have been taking to date is trying to get nations to agree to restrictions on carbon use or carbon emissions, and then have those nations go back and figure out themselves among like their industries and transportation and so on, how are you going to limit that, and then create laws that will impose some parameters with the idea that people's thoughts and behavior will then follow. As you know, with climate change, this hasn't made grand progress. Hasn't made much progress at all, really, in terms of substance. And backing up for a minute, in terms of discrimination, one has to question too. It almost seems like there's two steps forward, one step back, where there's lots of legal parameters in place. Has it changed individual perspectives? It's a little hard to say. It seems as if we take two steps forward and one step back, and just when it feels as if, in fact, there's been some progress made, society turns, incidents occur, and it seems like that's not the case. And then often, the conversation shifts to to look at a new set of people at the table, or a new table around which to have this conversation. In terms of race discrimination in the U.S., in the 60s, 70s, the table around which people were negotiating were housing and uh, basically, yeah, let's see, housing, employment discrimination, discrimination in serving people at public places, and those all got enshrined into law. Now we're having conversations around police practices. We're having conversations around transportation, which actually brings us back to development and government spending programs. So the table, or the piece of that very, very complex conflict, has shifted over time. So you can see that these public issues are very complex. In class, you were working on a very complex, much more local public issue, and that's the pollution of Lake Champlain. So what is the problem? I've got a problem. Lake Champlain is a mess, and so are quite a few of our other water bodies in Vermont. And I can point to where that pollution's coming from. It's coming from municipal septic systems. It's coming from unregulated farm use and manure spreading. It's coming from legacy soils when we have these big storm events, and erosion. It's coming from lawn chemicals and people's pet poo on their lawn, and their lawn fertilizers. So how do we get a handle on this? How do we change it? It's a problem for me because beach after beach in Lake Champlain is closed. We've got toxic algae growing that causes serious health effects. It's affecting Vermont's economy in terms of all of that lakeshore economy. So how do we get to a table? Who's the decision makers here? It seems to me as if the Vermont legislature and the Agency of Natural Resources have a lot of power to be decision makers here and change much of this. But there has just been enormous inaction. No one wants to come down hard on farmers because it's part of our Vermont culture. No one wants to come down hard on municipalities because upgrading these sewage systems is going to cost a fortune. And so we go year after year with this continuing to be an enormous problem. So, the question for you guys for this week is, if you were a professional mediator, could you get in here? Could you bring these people to the table? And where would you even start? What would you do? What would you say to the various parties? And where would you start to put this problem together? I'd like you to all think as you do that as to, in reality, how can we force a solution, or force a solution context? That is, how can we force the situation to get to a conflict resolution context so that forward progress is made? Because right now there's a lot of wheel churning. There's a lot of people talking about doing stuff, but the conflict resolution process has not engaged. There isn't forward progress here. It's like a train trying to go uphill on oiled tracks. There's a whole lot of churning being done, but it's not moving forward. How do you get a big public conflict like that to come to the table? So food for thought for you this week as we close out our substantive work and you move on to next week, explaining in your presentations the conflict you've been working on through this semester.